Lights, pyro, flames, energy. And DJ, drinks, music, energy. 9 p.m. in the heart of Kingstown, we descend upon the Geisha like never before. It's all about energy. Endless DJs, endless artists performing in one venue for one night only, starting at 9 p.m. April 30th. Don't miss it, please. Bring your colors, bring your crews. Energy, energies.
On Friday, April 29th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $270,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next lotto jackpot, $270,000.
More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way, Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
$700,000. That's the Super 6 jackpot for midday Friday, April 29th. It's a whopping $700,000.
More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way, Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
But trust me, my friend, things go nice again, it must again. Soca music must make we unite again. Lockdown, drink down, feeling, go down, take time, sit down, remember, came from, on the way, I'm positive, feeling the same, I'm following, I'm top. I'm on top. I don't want to stop. Thing go nice again.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Roundtable Talk for today, Wednesday, April 27, 2022. On today's program, we continue a reflection of the 2021 eruption of the La Soufrière volcano. It's the last in our series, which we conducted over the last month or so. And today, our guests are Director of Social Development, Narissa Finch-Burke, Engineering Assistant at Braxa, Absalom Hooper, I hope I got that pronunciation correctly, and Operations Manager at the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Red Cross, Julia Simmons. Welcome, gentlemen and ladies. In a sense, all of you had mobilization to deal with. You dealt mostly with mobilization. So I'm going to ask all three of you to begin by telling us, how did you mobilize for the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano? And probably we could begin with the Director of Social Development.
Thank you for this event. We were responsible for mobilizing even before persons would have evacuated, and it started from since the first week in January of 2021. We were responsible for community sensitization and mobilizing of communities to get ready for evacuation, assisting families in determining what were their family evacuation plans, which was critical. And we recognized that it became pertinent to do a more personalized, family-based engagement with persons in the communities doing house to house, so that we focus primarily on families where there are vulnerabilities, in particular, persons with disabilities, elderly persons, pregnant and lactating mothers. Those were some of the critical households that we had to identify in the early stages, and that was done through January to March of 2020. We collaborated with the Red Cross and its different teams at the level of communities to be able to confirm the registry of persons who would be listed as vulnerable and to encourage persons who were not encouraged to move, because we also had persons who resisted the need to move. And it is when we did the individual home related or home engaged type of interaction that people got an increased sense of satisfaction for the need to, develop certain plans. Who do they liaise with or look at to relocate? Sometimes they have to look at friends and other family members. What type of things to pack in the bag? We know that Nemo would have put a lot of bulletins out there that were looking at some of the things that person should pack or carry. But it is when we went on the ground in the communities with the different stakeholders, and in particular, a lot of community-based leaders, that persons got that real sense of urgency to say, you know what, this is probably serious, especially persons with disabilities and elderly persons. We try to let them make their connections with the relevant friends or loved ones to know where to go to. And that was critical in the mobilizing process.
Okay, Absalom?
Yes, thanks for having us to be on this evening. For us at Braxa, as was just said by our previous guest as well, when the first site of activity at the Soufre, that was in December, it was mobilized in Braxa that we started to put plans in place to ensure that things were together, because we understood that if there were to be an explosive eruption, then persons were going to be displaced, and as such, the shelters would require attention. So in relation to mobilization and looking at these shelters, we had teams of guys, plumbers, electricians, structural guys, going in, assessing, seeing what the needs were at the time, so that we could have proprietarily made certain addition and fix certain things that were in these shelters that would be required to be used by people who would have been displaced. Also, we were instrumental, I would say, in preparing the area where the geologists were housed. They were housed in Belmont in North Leeward, and we were retained to do some remedial works so that while they were there, they would have been comfortable. And so we're happy that we would have been able to have had that kind of input in ensuring that they were comfortable. And proprietary to the explosive eruption, we also had to put checks and balances in place just in case of the expenses that would have been projected, just in the event that the eruption took place, knowing that there would have been a lot of things to handle at that particular point in time.
Okay, Red Cross, a very integral part of the entire structure and the machinery. Tell us, how did you mobilize for the eruption?
For the Red Cross, we would have, as everyone said, started from the onset of the effusive eruption. Many persons don't consider that to be an eruption. They only looked at the explosive part of it. So, as mobilization and Mrs. Burke is saying, we had to get closer to the community and use our community contacts, response teams, CDRTs, group leaders to begin speaking to people so they would understand what it meant when they were seeing the effusive eruption, and that this is the time you need to start to prepare. We started working with NEMO, all other agencies of government at the EOC level, again at the community level. We did quite a number of work when it came to evacuation with mobilization as well. of the especially the vulnerable. We also did work with other entities that would have to transport persons, because when we were speaking about evacuation, we had to speak about how are you going to get them to move. And I believe Mrs. Buck would remember on the 8th, I think it was, we were sitting speaking about that exact conversation when we both were looking at each other with our telephones in our hand and got the message. I think it's explosively erupting right now. So at the Red Cross, we started preparing from December, as everyone is saying. We had also to ensure underground level persons understand their rules at the Red Cross. What were you expected to do? You were expected to ensure your homes were safe and you were packed and ready to go so that you can help others. That's what we always teach you at the Red Cross. Ensure that you're safe, you're packed and ready to go so that you can come out and help others. We ensured that our volunteers had all the necessary equipment for safety protocols because we were dealing with the pandemic at the same time. So we wanted to make sure that you were safe, you had all of your equipment to go out and help persons. We didn't have much equipment in the way of goggles and respiratory devices. So as much as possible, we tried to use things like N95 that would help protect them from inhaling that ash. We also ensured that persons working in shelters at the community level had safety devices and they were prepared. We made sure that the groups would know if persons go missing, tracing is one of your responsibility and you had to be prepared to find persons, assist with going back for persons with police and things like that. Those were some areas that we focused on as also. We worked along with the Central Water and Sewage Authority. What would be the critical problems that you would have for persons? And after we've had that engagement in the beginning, we made sure persons had water devices that they can collect water and other things like that. So these are some of the areas at the Red Cross that we started doing just from December itself. If you really think about all of ourselves in this group here, we can go back to Trade Winds of 2019. We had that practice where we had to practice that an active volcano had erupted. So for us, we had that prior practice and a bit of a taste of what the entire chaos would be like. So this is from where we started as well.
Okay, let's talk about some of the challenges that you all encountered in your mobilization and in preparation for this activity. We can go back to Mrs. Burke to start the ball rolling.
Thanks again. Some of the challenges, most times in situations like these, the challenges are more people-based. Like for instance, one of the key challenges from the initial stage was the reluctance of persons to accept the information, to get their buy-in, to be able to move. When you have to deal with vulnerable families, especially where they are elderly, remember, you have elderly persons and disabled persons, they are accustomed to their communities, their particular environment. So telling them to pack up to move, and especially the elderly where they had prior experience of the last eruption before 2021, where they felt that, my area, I didn't have to move, or some people would have complained that when it erupted back then, over 40 years, they with their experience, they followed the instructions, but yet when they came back, people stole their stuff and things of that nature. So they felt as though they wanted to protect their belongings, and they wanted to stay in a place of comfort or their particular environment. And that in itself created a headache for some, especially in terms of the search and rescue missions, because in particular, when we had the eruptions and some people still did not want to move, what about when we had the heavy ash fall and then you could not, visibility was very low? That is when we had multiple evacuations. And we had to be risking the lives of all our people, because it wasn't just about using the police. As Julia talked about the CDRTs, those volunteers, our community development officers, our social workers, etc., who had to be out there trying to help persons. You had persons with mental health challenges. And in order to negotiate with them to move, that in itself created further problems. You have to cater for particular types of transport, other types of logistics for persons. You also had persons falling ill because they are now moving, and it triggered a lot of things. So you had to cater for mass evacuations now into health facilities rather than into a shelter. So even things like that, you can predict as much as you can, but then when you look at having to mobilizing doesn't stop until people are safe, right? And that moment, even before, where we were going around community to community, the communities did not envision this level of evacuation that was required. And when the evacuation really started taking place, that is when people got serious. So that challenge now, having to risk the lives of officers so that we can actually save persons. Thank God nobody died during that process. But it took all hands on deck, and we really had to come out of our comfort zone, everybody, to ensure that this was done. And the other challenge, really, it's about the culture, the way of life of our people. When you have persons are accustomed to a particular thing or environment, you find that behavioral patterns of persons there, like for instance, some men in some communities, they stayed behind. And then you have to be in a position where it is unsafe, but at the same time, these persons are without food. How do we get it to them, even though they are staying behind for different reasons? Some persons stayed behind for valid reasons because, like for instance, some couldn't get out their animals in time, things of that nature. Some persons, you are waiting on a particular, whether it's an ambulance or something of that nature, because of the person who had to be moved, or you thought people moved, but they didn't. And then you now have to go back to find them in their homes. And in all that ashfall, to be able to locate them. So those were two key challenges at the point of mobilizing of people.
Very interesting. Hold that thought. We'll come back after we take our first break. Back in just a moment.
More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way. Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
$700,000. That's the Super 6 jackpot from midday Friday, April 29th. It's a whopping $700,000.
More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way. Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
But trust me, my friend, things go nice again, it must again. Soca music must make we unite again. Lockdown, drink down, feeling, go down, take time, sit down, remember, came from, I'm on the way, I'm positive, feeling the same, I'm following, I'm top, I'm on top, I don't want to stop, things go nice again.
On Friday, April 29th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $270,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next lotto jackpot, $270,000.
Welcome back. Mrs. Burke, you spoke about having a registry of people who are vulnerable. How reliable was this registry, and how did it help or aid in your preparations?
So that would have more represented pre-evacuation data records. It was reliable in that we worked with the CDRT teams with the Red Cross to do house-to-house validation of persons identified and also community leaders. However, where the difference is based on what was done in theory as opposed to what was executed in practice when it came to the actual evacuation was that we could not track persons when they actually moved, because persons would have said prior to the evacuation who would have plans to relocate to private infrastructure or shelters, or who would have gone into public shelters. But what happened in practice was that the majority of families would have gone into private shelters rather than public shelters. And that is where the disparity was. And it made it more difficult to locate persons because, of course, the physical infrastructure supporting public shelters, you know where they are. We have an inventory of which buildings they are and where they are placed. But when you're talking about people's homes, we do not have a national housing numbering system to locate people easily. So just imagine people are trying to give directions by them calling us, etc., to say where they are, and sometimes it's up a hill, across, behind a pole, so really crazy directions that time. And that in itself was really challenging. And hence we had to develop within the first 30 days national evacuation placement registry with the appropriate data and call center services, and so that persons can be able to log the calls so that we can be able to have everybody nationally registered. It was easier to work with shelter management as committee to identify all persons within public shelters, but that in itself became dynamic rather than static, because persons, when they were not comfortable in public shelter settings, they would gravitate to private homes. And in so doing, you had persons also being back and forth. It means that you have to have a better way of creating a unique registration process. Now, once we did that, the challenge with it was not everybody walked with their ID cards. So you couldn't use your national IDs to be able to match that this Teresa Daniel is different from Teresa Daniel in another community. Or you may have two Teresa Daniels from one particular community. How do we know who belongs to who? Another thing that happened with that as a challenge, even though it was a great initiative, is that persons, we have groups of people rather than a family that was getting lodging at a private shelter. So you had 15, 23 people in one person's home, but they were really probably 3 families. So then you had to be able to navigate, how are we going to move from just finding people? We wanted to find people so that at first we can feed them, provide water, because that was the first thing the first few days. Food shortages, water shortages. How do we get it to persons if we don't know where they were? Once we got that out of the way, we were able to use the same registry to then begin the process of doing the verification. We couldn't go out to persons because the ashfall was still heavy. And no, it didn't make sense that we couldn't find persons in the evacuation areas, granted that it was not safe for entry for anyone. So what we had to do, we had to do surveys. We had to do them virtually so that we can start confirming who is stationed where. Once we did that, we were able to get their demographic and socioeconomic information and move to the next level where we can be able to provide cash transfer and not just food packages in kind with water supply. The other thing with this was, which was great, we had a lot of donors that were probably individual donors or organizations like Rotary Club, etc., that were already on the ground for the first few days of the response. And they were just going everywhere trying to get food and water to people. So what we did, we reached out to them, those agencies, so that we can obtain their records of the persons that they would have given to, because it's not everybody was able to access phones to call. So in doing that, we would have used that to create one data pool of registered candidates or families moving forward. And that way, any agency from then on that would have required any ways in which they want to assist families, we had that national registry, so that dependent on how many families they want to assist, because like, for instance, we had Caritas who wanted to look at families from the red zone, 200 families where there are elderly or disabled persons living within it. We were able to filter the registry for persons fitting that description, especially if they were in private shelters. Because what happened, if you were in private homes, the disadvantage was that you had to wait for food boxes or use your own resources. Whereas in the public shelters, you were having standard meals, 3 times per day, so that, it was more standardized. The service was more consistent at the public shelters. So the priority was given to persons in private homes. So that was one example. So all donor agencies came on stream, whether it was because we also had individuals who wanted to partner. They reached out, we provided the registry of information that became the standard data pool. And based on what their request was, we filtered, we forwarded the data to them. And then their responsibility was to return to us the monitoring component or the reporting aspect of things based on the data that we provided, which families got what. So that way we know to try to reduce the duplication of the same thing to those families. So it was critical.
Great. You kind of answered a couple of questions that I had there for you even before I asked you. I'll ask Mr. Hooper and Simmons now to give their take on how they fitted into the entire scenario, what were the challenges and how did they manage them, etc.
All right. For us at Braxa, our response, as you know, would be more so after the explosive eruption took place. But previous to that, what the major challenge we had would have been relating to time and also allocation of resources, because with the impending eruption, there wasn't a definitive time as to when it would actually take place. And so without that definitive guide in terms of how do you spread the limited resources that you have in terms of getting the shelters ready for persons who have to be displaced, and also what emphasis you had to place in getting these shelters ready. So that was one of the challenge in terms of the time aspect, and also how do we allocate the personnel, because of course there are resources that was made available to us subsequent to the eruption that was not available previous to the eruption. So with the limited resources, we had to decipher what aspect of preparation we wanted to do. And the two aspects I think that major emphasis was placed on was ensuring that there was proper electricity in the various shelters, outlets working properly, making sure switches and those things. Also ensuring that the plumbing infrastructure is in place, pipe taps replaced that need to be replaced. Those where there's ruptured pipes, all of that being done. Where there's issues with water tanks, there may be need for water tanks and so on. Those are some of the things that we looked at prior to the eruption. Upon the explosive eruption, all of our agencies, departments went into full swing, and one of the major challenge we had then was in terms of, again, when we were allowed to go into certain areas to accomplish some of the tasks that would have been necessary in terms of cleanup and removal of ash and cleaning of buildings and things of that nature. So for us, time and also the allocation of resources would have been the major challenge in terms of mobilizing, doing what we needed to do before the explosive eruption.
Okay, Ms. Simmons?
Well, at the Red Cross, some of the challenges both agencies just mentioned, we've experienced some of them for ourselves, actually. Prior to the eruption, we had the challenge of the past experience affecting how people wanted to evacuate and people listening to the evacuation warnings and heeding to them. That was one of our greatest challenges. As much as Mrs. Burke spoke about going into the community and you spoke to people and you give them all that knowledge, information, warning, and told them how to pack, get ready. Persons wanted to move with an entire house. And if they couldn't move with that entire house, they refused to move at all. And it was at the point of when you couldn't see and you could not go back into the red zone is when people started calling you and begging you, please come and get me, because it became so explosive and dangerous. They wanted to get out and they were risking the lives of volunteers. And I wanted to shout out to the volunteers that see those fishermen that went back in and braved those sea waters and not being able to see to go in. They went further than the Coast Guard. They had to go in and bring to the Coast Guard persons, because persons were basically trapped at one point. We haven't heard enough about that, but this is what actually happened. And this is because a lot of persons, as much as we spoke to them and give them that information, they didn't listen. And that was because of past experience. A lot of them spoke about it not being as terrible as you thought it was. Even my own father said at one point, and he's from the Grenadines, I was able to fly out of St. Vincent in the last eruption. So I don't think it's a big deal. Until in the Grenadines, he opened the door and realized the entire place was covered in ash, and that's the Grenadines. So when I listened to different accounts of story from the past and what we had to deal with, we realized it was a lot to do with past experiences. And when I came back, I'm not gonna meet my household items and things that I have. So that was one of the challenges. Another challenge was at the point of evacuation, it was transportation for us. Transportation was provided, transportation was organized, but there was gridlocks on the road. We now have so much citizens with private transportation. Everybody was fleeing an explosive erupting volcano, and you had the government system and the transportations that were planned trying to get in to help. You know, we did foresee this happening, but we didn't foresee a lot of the persons deciding to, okay, I'm gonna take my own transportation. So again, as Mrs. Burke said, persons were scattered all over the place. When you had them specifically allocated for a particular shelter or area, they went to their own private shelters and different areas. That was difficult for us as well, to locate persons in the hours or the day after the eruption. Everyone had the same needs, water, cleaning, food. And basically that was easy for us to get to persons, but at the same time, we had that difficulty of locating them as well. Those were some of our challenges that we experienced as well.
We'll be back after this, our second break.
DJ, drinks, music, energy. 9 p.m. in the heart of Kingstown. We descend upon the Geisha like never before. It's all about energy. Endless DJs, endless artists performing in one venue for one night only. Starting at 9 p.m. April 30th. Don't miss it, please. Bring your colors. Bring your crews. Energy. Energies.
Welcome back. I wanted to ask Simmons and Hooper if they think that the communities were really prepared, or was there an over dependence on the government? Your thoughts on that?
For me, I think what went in proprietary in terms of information that was coming out from Nemo. I know Red Cross was doing the bits and pieces in the community to sensitize persons. I know persons who were personally invited, to attend some of the trainings that were offered to ensure that persons have an idea and an understanding of what would be required if and when there is an explosive eruption. And I think that the sentiment that was echoed earlier, that, some persons look back at what was in terms of 79 and was thinking that the eruption would be similar, mightn't be as intense, or if it is, it mightn't be that much worse than. So some persons would have had an approach of, taking it lighter than they should have in terms of preparing for the explosive eruption. But my take is that what needed to have gone in terms of the information, I think the information, came prior to the eruption. Information was going out on the airwaves, on the television. These are the locations, people who are evacuating from fit use. You are expected to evacuate to this community or to this shelter and the like. So the information, it got out there. It is just in a matter, I believe, that some persons didn't take it with the level of seriousness, that they should have in terms of preparing for the eruption.
Yeah, I would say the same, because the information was out there. Every bit and piece of information was there. The seismologist, every action that was happening, it was shared publicly. Persons were given that information. When you have Red Cross and mobilization and other agencies getting down to the level of the community and even bringing out on API pictures where they're telling you, this is what you should pack in a go bag, this is what you should do, and coming to your door, knocking on your door and trying to get you to move, and you're listening to persons recounting what happened back then, you realized this is why you needed to get closer to these families. But at the same time, persons didn't take it with the seriousness. And also for us, what we noted, persons were scared. I'm going into the shelter and I may be experiencing COVID. How are you going to protect me? I am going into the shelter and I have to be there with a large group of people. There are many of the things that happened in 1979 that was taboo and people still don't want to talk about, or it wasn't spoken about. But is it going to happen for me again? And that's why you had many families preparing themselves and going into private facilities, homes, or private shelters, as we'd like to call them. But it was not a case that they were dependent on government entirely. Persons did not at some point take it as serious as they should have, and persons had their own challenges internally where they chose not to evacuate, or they chose different means of evacuation to different areas and such.
Okay, I want to talk about the whole question of social protection programs. How were they managed? And I think, Mrs. Burke, this one is particularly for you. That was an important aspect of managing the crisis, social protection programs. What criteria did you use or did your department use to determine who got assistance?
Okay, so prior to the evacuation, all our sectors were responsible for developing our evacuation and response plans. And we would have in 2020 got cabinet approval to provide what we call a shock responsive social protection strategy. That caused us to develop what you call a family support grant structure to cater for holistic or comprehensive type of assistance for families rather than individual based grants. Because we recognize that the multiplicity of needs, as well as there are many where the entire family is experiencing the socioeconomic challenges rather than it being one individual. And we wanted to ensure that based on the supply that we have, that we can be able to practically meet the needs of basically the person. So it was that methodology for the shock responsive social protection strategy that was deployed utilizing the family support grant structure. What we did, we just simply converted the name of the grant to that of the Suffragette Relief Grant, but it had the same eligibility criteria outside of the criteria that you would have had to been from the red, orange, or yellow zone. So the geographical criteria would have been that you were from the affected zone, one, and two, that your family's average household income. Now that is important. It is the combination of all employed persons' income within the home divided by the total number of occupants in the home, and not just divided by the total number of working people, because the total income is to be consumed by the persons living there, whether in part or the whole thing. So that is the concept, the formula that we usually use to ascertain the income threshold that we will deploy. Now, when we look at the income threshold, we normally use the income threshold of $500 because that is where the poverty line sits, the average house of $500 per month. When we recognized the nature of the disaster or the scale of the disaster, working with donors, we were able to get cabinet approval to scale up the average household income to $1,000. Because just before, a couple months before that, we had the spike in COVID from the December into January, and we had the increase in the cost of living expenses, especially in terms of food supply, etc. And it was just creeping in the economy because of the recent spike in COVID that time. So as a result, we were able to move the income threshold from $500 per month per household to $1,000 per month. It was that criteria plus the geographical criteria of being from the red, orange, or yellow zone that we were able to identify the families to get cash transfer assistance. However, the universal assistance was for food packages. So it didn't matter your income levels, as long as you were registered. That's why we were encouraging all persons to register. If you are not able to visit a nearby shelter, go to NEMO's office, go to mobilization, wherever, with the point or call, at least we were asking, find a route to the nearest shelter or somewhere to at least register your household. Because we were using the National Placement Registry to be able to allot different transfers or assistance to persons. So with that said, we were able to then use now I spoke about earlier, the virtual survey, because we could not do, given the environment at the time, we could not do field verification, given the mass number of persons that were affected. So when we did the virtual survey, we were able to use that socioeconomic information to inform the eligibility criteria. And that is where, as long as you registered and we then did the verification process, we were able to establish the number of families that will be able to get cash transfer. When we looked at we had approximately 5,038 households that would have registered. Some from private, and the majority from private, and the minority was from the public shelters. Because the public shelters were getting 3 square meals per day, no matter their locations, we prioritized the cash transfer for persons in private shelters. When we identified the cash transfer monthly for private shelters, we were able to secure additional donor funding to provide a one-time cash transfer to persons in public shelters. What we did not issue the payment to public shelters when there was, mass persons in public shelters. We looked at the point where there were families who could not go home. There were persons from Chateaubelair, Fitzhugh's on the leeward end, and everyone from the north windward end that could not return and part of Georgetown. So as a result, all persons who were from those areas that were still in shelters after May 25th received a one-time cash value transfer for use while at public shelters. Other than that, between the period of May to November of last year, all families that fit the eligibility criteria equivalent to 3,388 households, they all received cash transfers. If you are a family of 1, it was equivalent to $300. Family of 2 to 3, $400. A family of 4 and over, $600. Plus, there was what you call in social protection a cash top-up. This cash top-up was for all families where vulnerability was identified. When we did the registration and the virtual assessment survey, we identified all households where there was a family member with being elderly, disabled, pregnant, or lactating mothers. Once that was identified within your family, an extra cash value of $200 towards that was added on. So the minimum that a family can get is $300, and the maximum that a family can get was $800. And that was per month between the month of May to November. And in the month of December, we were able to provide, in collaboration with WFP, the donor, we were able to provide the same equivalent, not in cash, but in Massey supermarket food vouchers for the very same families. In addition to this cash transfer, we had other donors come forward to provide a one-time cash transfer for the 399 families that were above the approved income threshold of $1,000 per month. Only based on those families who registered, we had 399 families who were above that average household income. We would have provided, in collaboration with ADRA, which is the Adventist Disaster Relief Agency, and with Red Cross. So ADRA would have provided for 338, and we also had 64 families from Red Cross who would have also received the very same thing. They were all paid by check. So like, for instance, you had like families where you had both persons working. You might be a teacher with a policeman, things of that nature, or higher income levels. And the household size was probably smaller than the average. Then they were identified for that one-time payment, whereas families where they were considered within the eligibility criteria received monthly payments. And all families on the registry would have then been afforded as well food packages. Each food package was valued at $300, paid for by the state. And it came up to a maximum of $20 million that was assigned to addressing food packages. We catered for 4,388 families. We not only looked at the families in the initial months when they would have been displaced in the green zone and in the Grenadines, but we had to do community distribution programs when families started to return. Once they started to return, we had approximately 4,300 families who returned where we were providing monthly food packages for those
And
families.
as you talk about when families return, we're going to take a final break. And when we come back, we will be talking about cleanup and the return to the communities. Back in just a moment.
Lights, pyro, flames, energy. And DJ, drinks, music, energy. 9 p.m. in the heart of Kingstown. We descend upon the Geisha like never before. It's all about energy. Endless DJs, endless artists performing in one venue for one night only. Starting at 9 p.m. April 30th. Don't miss it, please. Bring your colors. Bring your crews. Energy. Energies.
On Friday, April 29th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $270,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next lotto jackpot, $270,000.
Welcome back, Mr. Hooper. I want to start with you and ask, how did Braxa manage this mammoth task of cleaning up, and what are the plans for rebuilding and getting back to normal in the various communities that have been affected?
All right. In relation to our cleanup effort, it was quite a bit. Our cleanup effort commenced, I think, a week after the explosive eruption or the force explosive activity. Entailed in this cleanup activity, we had several equipments, and also it was a labor-intensive program because it was also a program that was designed to be a safety net in terms of providing income to persons who were available at that time to engage in cleaning. In the inception, we started in Kingston, where we started clearing, washing of roads, removal of whatever debris and stuff from Kingston, going into the Lowmans, going into areas like Camel Park, going back into Barley and the Leeward side in the first instance. Same thing happened on the Windward side, going back to as far as Byron, the Green Zone. And then when we received authorization to go further, our equipments, went into communities. We cleared a lot of ash. A lot of ash was removed out of the orange zone, the areas where we were given permission at that time. We cleared further down into the red zone in the latter part of our cleanup effort, and the deposit of ash was such that in some instances, especially on the windward side, when you look at the thickness, in some areas 3-4 feet of ash that had to be removed so that to allow access to for vehicular traffic and so on to get back into the area. One of the things that we appreciated is that persons did not evacuate from all of the communities within the red and the orange zone, and it was incumbent on us to partner with the other agencies, partner with like the police, with the health department, to ensure that in the event that there was an emergency, that there was the need for access. For instance, on the leeward side, the geologists who stayed in Belmont to observe what was happening, they were down on that side, and it was essential for us to get the road clear so that they would have been able to move freely, you know, and it was quite a bit. After we would have removed all of the ash from the road, we employed the use of trucks, water trucks, or concrete trucks that had the capacity to carry water and so on. We deployed them on the roads that they would wash the road surface to remove the debris, the residue, the dust that remain after the heavy cleaning. We also employed thousands of people received employment during the aftermath. In the initial stage, some 8,000+ persons in the month of coming out of April going into May and June received employment in terms of clearing of drains and clearing of buildings and so on, making sure that we went into the shelters, those shelters that was still close to the orange zone, like for instance the yellow zone like in Barley. Some of those shelters we had to ensure that, you know, whatever residual dust that were in the atmosphere was not getting into the schools, because you know the way schools are constructed, they are constructed with the need for ventilation, but the same ventilation was presenting a challenge in terms of ash would keep coming in. So we had to put mechanisms in place so to ensure that those persons who were in these shelters, they were comfortable. You know, we power wash the buildings, you know, removing of the residual ash and all of that from within these environments. So to ensure that there was a comfort. And going forward, in terms of in the latter end of the cleanup, we were able not only to clean roads but clean government buildings, and also to see the repairs of some important infrastructure. Clinics, we would have repaired 3 clinics on the leeward side that was that damaged and that needed. Even now we are still in the process of finishing one repair, which is in Coastal. We would have repaired the clinic in Rosal and also repaired the clinic in Chumuka. On the windward side, we also would have repaired the clinic that is in Fancy, in Oria, and also in Sandy Bay. And these investments went in to make sure that these amenities were available and remain available to persons as they return to their homes and take up back their lives as they would want it to be as before the eruption. And so we are quite happy that, you know, several persons, thousands of persons received financial, you know, injection from the effort of the government. And we also partnered with agencies such as the UNDP, the United Nations Development Project. They also provided some funding to Braxa to initiate drain cleanup and also the cleaning of government buildings. And the last part of it was to assist with the cleaning of feeder roads as farmers are going back into their lands, you know, to go back to their livelihoods. And we're really grateful for that. We also had assistance from the Mustique Charitable Trust that came in terms of to provide amenities for the buildings, especially schools, that were used as shelter, so that in the event that there is another unfortunate occurrence like the explosive eruption, there would be adequate or additional washroom facilities, places where people can go and wash their clothes and so on, because you expect that when persons evacuate from their home and go into these shelters, it's not going to be as they are in their homes, but we want it to be as comfortable as possible for them. And we're grateful that the Mustique Charitable Trust would have provided some funding and washrooms and so on, bathrooms, additional bathrooms went in, so that in the event that there is another evacuation for whatever reason, persons would be a little bit more comfortable going forward. So we are happy at where we are now, because most of the ash is off the road in terms of the main road, village roads. We are finishing up our cleaning in some of the farm feeder roads. As I indicated, farmers are going back into their lands. There's still some roads where there are residual ash that we didn't get to do as yet, but we're working towards it. And we are really hopeful, that as we would have done before, we'll be able to accomplish those, and, persons can go back to life as they knew it before the explosive eruption.
Thank you very much. That was quite a mouthful. It's important to note that all of this work is being done as part of the national system with cooperation and coordination among a variety of agencies. We are out of time, and there are so many things that we really could talk about. Maybe I have to bring you guys back on another edition of this program. We haven't spoken about the psychosocial component, so many other things that we haven't touched this evening. And you wanted one last word, you said?
No, I just wanted to, appreciate the investment from the government. Some $23 million went into the cleanup effort. And right now we are in a roof repair program being funded by the government as well. And, houses that would have been damaged, persons who are unable to return home, they are now able to return because their roofs will be fixed. And those persons whose homes were destroyed, we're in the process of making arrangement to have houses being rebuilt for persons. So I really appreciate that effort and the injection of funds to make sure that persons are receiving some assistance in the aftermath of this explosive eruption.
Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate your being here this evening. That's all the time we have, but I am going to get you back here one of these days in another few weeks or so to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Mrs. Burke. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Mr. Hooper. That's all on today's program. We are so happy that you could join us. Do join us again next week, Wednesday at the same time, for another edition of Roundtable Talk. Good evening.
Carnival's important. Carnival is more important than I think we perhaps admit it to ourselves, and in society it's important. And my fear is that if we go on without Carnival for too much longer, you'll start losing a part of what's important to people.
Again. More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way. Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
$700,000. That's the Super 6 jackpot for midday Friday, April 29th. It's a whopping $700,000.
More jackpot money, more reasons to play this game. More money for way. Super 6 a bigger jackpot game.
Lights, pyro, flames, energy. And DJ, drinks, music, energy. 9 p.m. in the heart of Kingstown. We descend upon the Geisha like never before. It's all about energy. Endless DJs, endless artists performing in one venue for one night only. Starting at 9 p.m. April 30th. Don't miss it, please. Bring your colors, bring your crews. Energy, energies.
On Friday, April 29th, there'll be thousands of dollars to be won. A lotto jackpot of $270,000. A new home, car, or that college education.
Lotto, you have to be in it to win it.
Next Lotto jackpot, $270,000.